In 1500, a single handful of peppercorns could buy you a house. A single nutmeg could purchase a ship. And men sailed straight into certain death for a spice that most people today toss carelessly onto their morning lattes. This isn't ancient trivia. This is the blueprint for how wealth, power, and entire empires are built and then destroyed. Most people look at history as a series of disconnected events. Wars here, discoveries there, empires rising and falling for reasons we vaguely attribute to greed or fate. But there's a pattern hiding beneath the surface, a pattern that repeats across centuries, across continents, across every era of human civilization. And it always starts the same way, with a single commodity everyone desperately needs, but only a few can control. For over 1,000 years, that commodity was spices, not gold, not silver. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves drove more wealth creation and destruction than any precious metal ever could. Today, most people simply dismiss spices as mere kitchen trivia, a footnote in dusty history books. But those who truly understand what really happened, the monopolies, the violence, the corruption, the collapse, will recognize the exact same forces shaping our world right now. What you're about to see isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning, because the pattern that built and destroyed spice empires is repeating today, with different commodities, different players, but the same inevitable outcome. The only question that remains is, will you see it coming before everyone else does? To truly understand what happened, you need to forget everything you think you know about spices. Walk into any kitchen today, and you'll find pepper sitting in a cheap plastic shaker, cinnamon sprinkled carelessly on a latte, nutmeg gathering dust in the back of some forgotten cabinet. We treat these substances as utterly mundane, barely worth a second thought, but for most of human history, they were anything but ordinary. In medieval Europe, peppercorns were counted out individually like precious coins. Rents were paid in cloves. Dowries were measured in cinnamon sticks. Wealthy families locked their spices in iron-bound chests, guarded as carefully as gold and jewels. And in many cases, spices were actually worth more than gold. Consider this. In 15th century England, a single pound of nutmeg cost the equivalent of 7 fattened oxen. A sack of pepper could set a merchant family up for generations. Cloves were so valuable that possession of them was restricted by law. Commoners caught hoarding spices faced imprisonment. This wasn't irrational obsession. There were deeply practical reasons. In an age without refrigeration, spices were essential for preserving meat through brutal winters. They masked the taste of food that had begun to spoil. They served as medicines, treating everything from plague symptoms to digestive ailments. And beyond survival, spices signaled status. If you could afford pepper on your table, you had arrived. But here's the part that mattered most for wealth and power. Nobody in Europe actually knew where spices came from. Arab traders controlled the supply routes from the east, and they weren't about to reveal their sources. Instead, they spun elaborate myths. Cinnamon harvested from nests of giant birds on distant cliffs, pepper guarded by venomous serpents in hidden valleys. These stories weren't entertainment. They were strategic disinformation. By keeping origins shrouded in mystery, Arab merchants maintained a monopoly on information, the first and most powerful monopoly of all. European buyers had no choice. They paid whatever prices traders demanded, and gold flowed eastward in staggering quantities, draining the continent for centuries. But every monopoly creates desperation among those locked outside it. And desperation breeds innovation, or violence. One European city figured out how to crack this system, not by discovering the source, but by controlling the choke point. And in doing so, they built the world's first true financial empire. That city was Venice. While the rest of Europe was still mired in feudalism, kings fighting over muddy territory, peasants bound to the land, and economies running on barter, Venice was building something entirely different. The Venetians understood something that most of their contemporaries couldn't grasp. You don't need to own the product. You just need to control its flow. Venice sat at the perfect crossroads. The spices flowed from India and Indonesia to Arab ports. From there, they crossed overland to the Mediterranean. And Venice, with its strategic position and naval dominance, controlled the final bottleneck into Europe. The Venetians didn't grow a single pepper vine. They never set foot on the Spice Islands, but they extracted more wealth from the spice trade than anyone actually producing the goods. And here's where Venice became truly revolutionary. They invented modern finance to do it. Venetian merchants pioneered sophisticated contracts, insurance policies for cargo ships, and early forms of banking. They created a system where risk could be shared among investors, pooling money from multiple sources to fund increasingly ambitious trading voyages. While kings fought wars with sword and shield, Venetian bankers conquered with ledgers and interest rates. The wealth that flowed into Venice was staggering. The city built palaces on water. Its merchant princes lived in luxury that rivaled and often exceeded the crowned heads of Europe. By the 15th century, Venice controlled more liquid wealth than entire kingdoms. But the Venetians made a critical mistake that every monopoly eventually makes. They assumed their position was permanent. They grew comfortable, complacent. They believed the geography that favored them would always protect them, that no one could bypass their stranglehold on Mediterranean trade. What they failed to anticipate was that desperation makes people creative. The rest of Europe was hemorrhaging gold to Venice and the Arab traders beyond. Portugal, a small, poor kingdom clinging to the edge of the Atlantic, was particularly desperate. They couldn't compete with Venice through existing routes. Their only option was to find an entirely new path. And in 1498, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama did exactly that. He sailed around the southern tip of Africa, endured storms that killed half his crew, and arrived on the shores of India, bypassing every single middleman that had grown fat on the spice trade. In a single voyage, he made Venice's entire business model obsolete. It wasn't a war that broke Venice's grip on the spice trade. It wasn't an army or a plague. It was a technological disruption, a new route that made the old gatekeepers irrelevant overnight. And what followed was not a peaceful transfer of power. It was violent, bloody, and would reshape the entire world. Vasco da Gama didn't just discover a new trade route. He kicked off a scramble that would redraw the map of the world in blood. When da Gama returned to Lisbon with a cargo hold full of spices, he had proven something transformative. The Arab-Venetian monopoly could be broken. You didn't have to pay tribute to the old gatekeepers anymore. You could sail directly to the source. But da Gama understood something else, something darker. If Portugal wanted to control this new route, they couldn't just trade peacefully. They had to dominate it militarily. What followed was a campaign of calculated brutality. Portuguese ships arrived in Indian Ocean ports not as merchants seeking fair exchange, but as conquerors demanding submission. When the ruler of Calicut refused Portuguese terms, da Gama's response was to bombard the city with cannon fire. He captured merchant ships, executed their crews, and sent a message that would echo across Asia: submit or be destroyed. Portugal established fortified trading posts along the African and Indian coasts, not to enable free commerce, but to control it absolutely. Any ship that tried to trade spices without Portuguese permission was subject to seizure or sinking. In effect, Portugal transformed the Indian Ocean into a Portuguese lake, with all trade flowing through points they controlled. Meanwhile, Spain was making its own desperate gamble. Convinced that sailing west would provide an even faster route to the spices of Asia, the Spanish crown funded an ambitious and many believed foolish expedition led by Christopher Columbus. Columbus never found the spices he was looking for. What he found instead were the Americas, a discovery that would eventually yield wealth far beyond anything the spice trade ever produced. But in the immediate term, Spain was losing the spice race to Portugal. The competition grew so fierce that the two Catholic kingdoms nearly went to war with each other. In 1494, they literally divided the world between themselves with the Treaty of Tordesillas, a line drawn on the map with everything east going to Portugal and everything west to Spain. The Pope blessed it. No one asked the people who actually lived in those places. This is what most people miss about the Age of Discovery. It wasn't driven by curiosity or human spirit. It was driven by commodity hunger. Every voyage, every conquest, every massacre was ultimately about controlling the supply of goods that Europe desperately craved. The pattern should look familiar. When a resource is valuable enough, nations will do anything to control it. They'll wage wars, commit atrocities, and reshape the global order. The specific commodity changes. Spices in the 1500s, oil in the 1900s, something else tomorrow. But the underlying logic never does. And Portugal and Spain, for all their brutality, were just the opening act. The real corporate monsters were about to enter the stage. In 1602, the Dutch did something that had never been done before. They created a monster. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, was not simply a trading business. It was a corporation with the legal power to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, mint money, and execute criminals. A private company with the authority of a nation-state. The numbers were unprecedented. At its peak, the VOC commanded more ships than most European navies. It employed tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors. Its market capitalization, adjusted for inflation, exceeded the combined value of Apple, Amazon, and Google today. $78 million in 17th century terms, a figure so large it's almost meaningless. The British followed with their own version, the East India Company. These weren't competitors in any normal sense. They were machines designed to extract maximum profit from the spice trade, and they would eventually come to control entire subcontinents. How did they operate? First, they centralized capital. Instead of individual merchants risking their own money on dangerous voyages, thousands of investors pooled resources. This spread risk across the entire Dutch population. Butchers, bakers, and widows bought shares in spice expeditions. The modern stock market was born from the hunger for pepper profits. Second, they monopolized violence. The VOC maintained private armies and navies that answered to shareholders, not governments. When negotiation failed, which was often, they simply took what they wanted. The relationship between corporate profit and organized killing was explicit, not hidden. The Banda Islands offer the clearest example. These tiny specks in the Indonesian archipelago were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew. The VOC wanted total control. When the local population resisted, Dutch forces massacred 90% of the inhabitants, 15,000 people murdered, so that shareholders in Amsterdam could earn dividends on their nutmeg investments. This wasn't an aberration, it was the business model. The British East India Company eventually went further, conquering and administering the entire Indian subcontinent. A trading company ruled hundreds of millions of people. Corporate executives commanded armies larger than most European nations possessed. What makes this history relevant today isn't just the scale of atrocity, it's the template that was established. The idea that corporations can become more powerful than governments, that private entities can operate across borders beyond meaningful regulation, pursuing profit with the resources of nation-states, that shareholder returns justify almost any means. We tell ourselves this is ancient history. But look at modern technology giants whose market caps exceed the GDP of most countries. Look at private military contractors operating in conflict zones. Look at companies with more data on citizens than governments possess. The VOC and EIC weren't accidents. They were prototypes. The investors who funded these expeditions didn't think of themselves as architects of genocide. They thought they were being smart with their money, buying into a growth opportunity. The violence happened far away, out of sight. The dividends arrived, cleaned of blood. This separation between profit and consequence was the VOC's most lasting innovation. It persists today in every portfolio that doesn't ask where returns actually come from. But empires built on extraction face an inevitable problem. The same structures that enable growth eventually ensure collapse, and the spice empires were rotting from within. Portugal stretched itself across 3 continents with a population smaller than modern Philadelphia. The Dutch East India Company paid dividends even as its debts mounted into catastrophe. Spain flooded with treasure while its actual economy withered. Every spice empire followed the same trajectory: explosive growth, then slow decay, then sudden collapse. And in every case, the seeds of destruction were planted during the years of greatest success. Portugal's problem was simple mathematics. You cannot garrison forts from Mozambique to Macau, patrol thousands of miles of ocean, and fight constant wars against local resistance with a domestic population of 1 million people. The empire was always a facade, impressive at a distance, hollow up close. Each decade brought more commitments, more enemies, more expense. By the late 16th century, Portugal was borrowing money to maintain positions that generated less revenue than they cost. The VOC's collapse was more insidious. As the company matured, corruption consumed it from within. Officials stationed in Asia realized they could skim profits, falsify records, and live like kings far from any oversight. The distance that had once protected Dutch trade secrets now protected Dutch embezzlement. By the late 1700s, the VOC was technically bankrupt, kept alive only by creative accounting and government intervention. When the company finally dissolved in 1799, it carried debts equivalent to billions in modern currency. Spain presents the strangest case: death by success. Silver from American mines and profits from global trade should have made Spain the permanent hegemon of Europe. Instead, easy money destroyed the productive economy. Why manufacture goods when you can simply buy them with stolen silver? Why develop industries when treasure ships keep arriving? Spanish prices inflated while Spanish manufacturing declined. The money flowed through Spain and into the pockets of Dutch, English, and French merchants who actually made things. Economists call this the resource curse. When wealth comes from extraction rather than production, it corrodes the skills and institutions that enable long-term prosperity. The spice empires learned this lesson centuries before oil-rich nations repeated the same mistake. But there's a deeper pattern here. Monopoly profits breed complacency. When money flows regardless of efficiency, organizations stop adapting. They become rigid, bureaucratic, and blind to changing conditions. The VOC kept paying dividends even as it drowned in debt because admitting failure was institutionally impossible. By the time these empires recognized their vulnerability, it was too late to reform. The rot was structural, and then something changed that no amount of military force or financial engineering could reverse. The commodity itself, the very thing that had made them powerful, began losing its value. When that happened, everything unraveled. For centuries, nutmeg and pepper commanded prices that justified armadas and massacres. Then, over a few decades, they became cheap kitchen staples that nobody thought twice about. The mechanism was devastatingly simple. Supply finally caught up with demand. The same empires that fought to monopolize spices ultimately destroyed their own scarcity. Dutch colonists transplanted nutmeg trees from the Banda Islands to plantations across Indonesia. British agents smuggled cuttings to Ceylon and Grenada. French spies stole pepper plants for cultivation in their own tropical colonies. Each successful transplant was a nail in the coffin of monopoly pricing. As production spread across multiple colonial powers, the artificial scarcity evaporated. Competition emerged. Prices cratered. Pepper that had once bought houses became so abundant it was used as ship ballast. This is the commodity trap, the economic death spiral that awaits every empire built on controlling scarce resources. When you monopolize a commodity, you create enormous incentives for others to break your monopoly. The higher your prices, the greater the reward for anyone who finds an alternative source. Your very success guarantees eventual competition. The Dutch understood this intellectually. They literally burned nutmeg crops to keep supply limited and prices high. But they couldn't burn every tree on every island across the entire tropical world. The secret was out. The scarcity was artificial. And artificial scarcity can't survive forever against determined competitors. The Venetian, Portuguese, and Dutch empires had all assumed their commodity would remain precious indefinitely. They built institutions, debts, and military commitments predicated on sustained prices. When those prices collapsed, the entire structure became unsupportable. This should sound familiar. Consider oil. For decades, petroleum underpinned the wealth of nations and the power of corporations. Now, alternative energy sources threaten the same commoditization that destroyed spice fortunes. The next decade will reveal whether petrostates and oil majors can adapt, or whether they'll follow the Dutch East India Company into history. Consider data. Today, personal information is the new spice, fought over, monetized, and concentrated in the hands of a few giants. But what happens when privacy regulations, decentralized systems, or simple consumer exhaustion undermine the data economy? The lesson from spices is that no commodity dominance lasts forever. The only question is whether you see the transition coming, or whether you're left holding worthless inventory while the world moves on